Okay, everyone, I think we'll get started now, and I'm sure more people will join us in the next minute or two. But good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Preventing Food Crime and Reducing Risk Across the Sector. My name is Sophie Milne, and I'm the Events Manager at Food Standards Scotland. We've got a great and busy agenda lined up for you today, and I'm excited to introduce our speakers who are all experts in their fields. So firstly, we have Ron McNaughton, Head of the Scottish Food Crime and Incidents Unit at Food Standards Scotland, who will be kicking off the webinar by providing some background into our online food crime risk profiling tool and how we see businesses using the tool. Then Chris Elliott, Professor of Food Safety and Microbiology at Queen's University Belfast, will be setting the scene on food crime and giving some examples of risks. David Thompson, CEO of the Food and Drink Federation Scotland, will be talking about the importance of the Scottish food and drink sector. And lastly, Salvareni Alahi, Executive Director of the Food Authenticity Network, will be looking at the Food Authenticity Network's resources and whether global food fraud is increasing. So thank you all very much for joining us today. But before I hand you over to our presenters, though, I'd just like to remind you quickly of a few housekeeping rules. Since we're on Teams Live, you will not be able to unmute your microphones to ask questions. We do, however, welcome any questions and comments you may have, and you can post these into the chat, which should appear at the top of your screen. There will be time for questions at the end, but we do have a busy agenda, so we'll try and get through as many of them as possible. And today's webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be shared in due course. So I'll pass you over now to Ron McNaughton. Thank you.
Thanks, Sophie. I take it everyone can see my presentation, yep? Sophie, yeah?
Yep, all good.
Okay, yeah. Thanks, Sophie, for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Many thanks for taking the time out of your busy day to attend our first food crime webinar. What a great turnout. I suppose we're all here today because we have a common interest in food crime. For those of you who own or run a food business, you're looking for advice and guidance that can help you avoid becoming a victim of crime. And for FSS and the Scottish Food Crime and Incidents Unit, although we have a part to play in dealing with those individuals who commit food crime, we also have a part to play in supporting the industry through food crime prevention. And it's an absolute priority for me as head of food crime for FSS that we take that forward. Food crime is a problem for Scotland and the UK as a whole. Make no mistake about it. Every sector is at risk. The impact on public health and on the economy has the potential to be significant. Research conducted by the University of Portsmouth and published by Food Standards Agency in 2023 suggested that the estimated cost of food crime on the UK ranged between 410 million and 1.96 billion annually. Now that's the cost to consumers, businesses and government, and the reason for the wide range in the costs represented is the disparity between officially reported crime statistics and unreported activity. Now, I'm sure you'll agree that's absolutely massive, and unfortunately there's no good news that's going to get any better anytime soon. Favourable conditions for criminality continue to be present. We've seen EU exit, COVID-19, price inflation, extreme climate events, the UK and Russian conflict and other geopolitical events having an impact on global food supply chains. And this has opened up new avenues with increased incentives to commit food crime. What we can do, though, is work together to tackle this common enemy. Food businesses need to treat food crime risks alongside other business risks, target harden their businesses and improve their food fraud resilience. In 2024, we published a food crime prevention strategy founded on the purpose and central idea that you can see on your screen. It's our dedicated plan that we're going to follow and complete by 2027. Our aim is to work with key stakeholders in identifying effective long-term preventative actions to help mitigate food crime and its reoccurrence in order to protect consumers and food businesses. Our strategy is linked to the FSS priority outcomes, which is food is safe and authentic. Responsible food businesses are able to thrive, and FSS is trusted and influential. It's got 5 strategic goals, which in general cover identifying stakeholders and improving stakeholder and consumer engagement, improving data analysis, improving communication channels between FSS and industry for lessons learned and best practice, and developing a collaborative approach to food crime prevention with our colleagues at the Food Standards Agency, wider UK stakeholders and international partners. It's a food crime prevention model for Scotland, which focuses on collaboration and partnership working. That means FSS continuing to work closely with key partners like local authorities, other law enforcement partners, the food industry, and academia. One of the first initial steps was for us to launch our food crime risk profiling tool, which we developed with the help of Culture Compass. The tool allows businesses to accurately assess their processes and procedures against four key areas: strategy, performance, organisation, and culture. Once you sign up and use the tool, you will be asked to consider 10 statements under each of these areas and compare these in relation to how your business operates. The statements cover the subcategories shown on the screen. You can see an example of one of the statements on the screen also. You simply have to record your answers ranging from strongly agree to strongly disagree in terms of how your business operates or what it has in place. It should take around 30 to 40 minutes to complete. For this to be accurate, and you need to be open and honest, give an open and honest evaluation of your business's processes and procedures. That way you'll get an accurate assessment of the areas where your business is vulnerable and where you need to do something. It will also give you an indication of where you've got some good practice in place. The system's automated, so you should receive your tailored report pretty quickly and certainly within 30 minutes. And it pretty much looks like what you can see on the screen now. The report will be unique to your business, and you won't be asked to go away and consider any large guidance documents. It will include some high-level guidance, targeted guidance in relation to where your business appears vulnerable to food crime. And you need to use that guidance in order to ensure, as best as you possibly can, that your business does not become the victim of food crime. Included in the report are links to other guidance and tools that you can use. Last year, we had some additional free workshops for those businesses who had used the tool, and we plan to run some more of those over the coming months. And the workshop itself allows us to discuss the four key areas in more detail and pick up in any good practice that is being used out there in industry to good effect. If you sign up for the tool, then you'll be invited to take part in those future workshops. The tool is free for anyone to use. If you haven't done so yet, I hope that after hearing a bit more detail about it, in particular after hearing what Chris, David and Silverani have to say, that you will see the benefit in using whatever tools and guidance that are out there to protect your business against food crime. It would be remiss of me not to mention our colleagues at the National Food Crime Unit at the Food Standards Agency, who also have a food fraud resilience self-assessment tool that can be used by businesses. These resources are free, other than your time. So I would encourage you to use what is available in order to protect your business. We'll show the links to the tool at the end of the webinar. Just one final point from me before we move on. If you have any information about food crime, you can report it to our free Scottish Food Crime Hotline that we run in partnership with Crime Stoppers. It runs 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. The numbers are on screen now. The hotline is completely confidential. Any information that's passed to the hotline will be passed us within 4 hours, and I can promise you that we'll act upon it. And there's also an online version which you can access going into the FSS website. And that's it. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm going to pass you back to Sophie before we hear from our other panel members.
Thank you very much, Ron. And yeah, we've posted the link in the chat, which you can access once the webinar's finished and sign up. And so now I'm going to hand you over to Chris Elliott, who's going to kind of set the scene on food crime. And Ron, I'm not sure if you're able to unshare your slides. Perfect, thank you. Okay, over to you, Chris.
Thank you. So many thanks, Sophie. And I'm really pleased to be participating in this webinar today. As Ron said, this is a pretty important subject, quite a difficult subject to talk about. And I can see there's several hundred people have actually signed in for this webinar. That, to me, this is really good news. Now, first of all, I wish I had time to play my favorite game with you. And my favorite game is called the Food Fraud Game. I've been playing this with students at quite a number of different universities. When I speak at dinners, I play the game, and it is, I ask for any type of food ingredient, commodity, name it, and within 30 seconds, I will tell you a fraud associated with it. 30 seconds. I've been playing the game for about 10 years, and I am the undefeated champion, okay? Nobody has ever beaten me, because there is fraud with every type of food, ingredient, commodity that you can think of. I also call it salt to saffron. You'll get fraud in salt, and actually there was a really quite famous case in Scotland. Salt is the world's cheapest ingredient for food, and there is massive fraud in saffron, which is the world's most expensive food ingredient, and there's fraud in everything in between. People will exploit food systems in a multitude of different ways you couldn't imagine. Right. I also, you're actually really lucky. I have a 2-hour lecture, and it's called Why I Invented Food Crime. Now, I'm not a criminal. I might look like one, but I guarantee I'm not a criminal. But I actually invented the term food crime. I did that in 2013 when I was in the office of the then Secretary of State for DEFRA, Owen Paterson, and I was trying to convince Owen, this isn't something that's trivial. This is really serious. It's criminal activity. It's food crime, and it is. It is, something that is difficult to comprehend the scale of it. Ron gave you some numbers. I mean, globally, we're talking about more money is made in food fraud than the entire heroin trade in the world. So there's a lot of money to be made. Now, who are the bad guys? Who are the criminals out there? And this is not easy or straightforward. And over the years, we've done quite a lot of research trying to find out who the bad guys are. And often it can be businesses that you've done, you've had business relationships with for a long time. They can have some financial pressures, or they want to increase their profit margins. They'll start to cut corners and go, actually, that was quite easy. And then it develops further and further and further. And we have found that it can be very small family-run businesses, but it can also be quite large corporates as well, who are struggling to make the targets for their shareholder base. So there's a lot of motivations there. Also, we've found is there are quite a lot of networks of criminals who will work together. And there is one case, I can't talk too much about it because it's still undergoing investigation, but we call it the Facebook fraud network. And it's people who are actually connected in Facebook. Somebody will get some counterfeit materials, and then they'll use this network to sell it in different parts of the country or across different countries as well. And then there is the organized crime element, and more evidence of organized crime really getting much more involved in issues around fraud in the food system than ever before. It could be drug cartels coming from Central and South America. It can be triad gangs from Southeast Asia, the mafia in Europe. And it is because there is the opportunity to make so much money. The risk of actually being found out is quite low. And if they are found out, generally the penalties are quite trivial. Trivial except if you're in China, because if you're caught in China, you get executed. Now, just to give you one example of things that can go badly wrong, I decided to talk about apple puree. And you think, well, what's the risk of apple puree? But last year there was a major incident in terms of apple puree, and was actually being sold in the United States. It affected young infants because it was in the applesauce that lots of people give to their children. In my case, my grandchildren absolutely love their apple puree. And there was hundreds of cases of infants getting sick from consuming apple puree. And you know what it was? They were suffering from lead poisoning. And there was all of these questions. How did lead get into apple puree? And the answer was, it wasn't the apples, it was the cinnamon that was added, the flavoring, the cinnamon. You often get, cinnamon flavored apples. And there was a cheating going on in terms of the cinnamon because lead chromate was being added to the cinnamon to enhance its color and enhance its value. That actually happened in Ecuador, of all places. The apples didn't come from Ecuador, the cinnamon didn't come from Ecuador, but it was part of this really complex supply chain. So those, I could give you 100 examples of 100 different types of things that can go wrong. And, often now I am being asked about the implications of what's called EUDR, the European Union Deforestation Directive, and how that's really going to accelerate fraud in things like palm oil and soya and meat and coffee, cocoa. So a very good piece of legislation that actually can become a driver for fraud. Now, it is difficult, it's very complex. Lots of businesses ask me, where do we start? How do we manage this? And I work with some of the world's biggest multinational companies, and my goodness, they need a lot of help and advice, even though they've got really big technical groups. So if you're a medium-sized business, where do you get this help from? And to my mind is the tool that Ron talked about. It's free, it's easy to use, and my goodness, that will give you a really strong indication of where your weaknesses lie. And again, for many years, I've been helping businesses do risk assessments in terms of food safety risks. And equally now, I help businesses do risk assessments in terms of vulnerabilities to fraud. Ron talked about all of those different drivers that are going on. It's climate change, it's geopolitics, and the risks will change. We get massive perturbations in supply chains because of all of these different factors. So I would really strongly recommend that businesses use that tool, easy to use, and say, if you don't use it, it's criminal. So that's all from me. I'll pass you back to Sophie.
Thank you so much, Chris. It's always great listening to you, hearing from you. So yeah, I'll hand over now to David Thompson, who's CEO of the Food and Drink Federation in Scotland. And he's going to speak a bit about the Scottish food and drink sector.
Thanks, Sophie. Hi, everyone. I'm David. So I head up the Food and Drink Federation in Scotland. We're a trade association of food and drink manufacturers, and we have businesses that go from some of the largest businesses in the world to some of the smallest businesses in Scotland as part of our membership, which is great. So I've been asked to say a little bit about the food and drink sector in Scotland and its importance. I'll say also a little bit about why having a strategy for food crime and getting involved with Ron and the tool are really important as well. So those of you who know the industry in Scotland know how important it is. It's worth £15 billion in turnover a year, and it is worth £7 billion in exports a year. Now, to put that into context, Scotland exports a third of the total UK food and drink exports. So we're not just feeding people in the UK, we're feeding people across the whole world with products that are made in Scotland. And that's why, given that value, and given the amount of food and drink that's produced here, it just shows you how important it is to make sure that food safety and supply chain risk are absolutely critical in businesses' mind. As Ron and Chris have said, it is an incredibly turbulent time. We have had all of the supply chain disruption of COVID, of Brexit, of the Ukraine war, of climate change risks, and a whole range of other things that have put supply chains that have lasted for a long time under severe strain. And we see this all over with commodity prices increasing and manufacturers looking to find suppliers from different parts of the world and in different ways to approach it. Chris also mentioned the advancing of regulation. So the EU deforestation regulation, there will be a UK deforestation regulation as well. And all of that is putting additional pressure on reporting on supply chains, as Chris said, for all the right reasons, but in ways that increase cost for businesses and increase the opportunity for fraud as well. So all of that paints a picture where businesses need to take this incredibly seriously, and even more seriously than they have done before, because food crime can affect any business, regardless of sector and regardless of size. It's everyone's responsibility, from the chief executive officer all the way through to the person who lets the goods into the factory. And it's critical that people understand a food safety management system that takes all of that seriously all the way through the company. You need senior level buy-in to make sure it's being taken seriously across the whole business. So it's difficult, and there are challenges there for businesses, and they need to take this incredibly seriously. But there is support available, and that's what today's webinar is about. At FDF, we have our Food Authenticity Guide, which is a 5-step process to identify, prioritize, and manage supply chain authenticity risks. But we know that these steps should be seen as a cycle to be reviewed and repeated on a regular basis, and in particular when there is a change in ingredient, a change in supplier, or there's emergence of a new risk. And that's why things like the Food Crime Risk Profiling tool are incredibly useful, because they can add and support to this type of guidance and to the way that companies are looking at changes in their ingredients, changes in their supplier, or when there's an emerging new risk, as we'll hear about later on as well. So it's really important that you take these opportunities up. These are free resources that are available to anyone, and will give you a rapid insight into where you need to take action or consider strengthening your controls. The National Food Crime Unit in England, and of course Ron's Scottish Food Crime and Incident Unit, provide a wealth of information and are really open to connecting with businesses and to supplying information and supporting them with information as they go forward. And they're a resource that we should all be using regularly and making sure we are supporting our businesses by taking use of. The cost of this, Ron's already outlined. It's a significant amount of money to the overall picture of that 15 billion turnover in Scotland, but also in particular to your bottom line. So getting food crime risk right and supporting authenticity and integrity are really, really important in terms of business viability. Going back to Scotland's fantastic food and drink industry, the image we project and our ability to deliver £7 billion of exports, we need to make sure that that is built on a food safety culture and a food risk culture that is robust and that can ensure that people can trust in the food that they eat. So it's really, really important, and I'm really heartened to see so many businesses on the line, over 200 people dialed in, because I would urge you all to think carefully about how you can use the risk profiling tool and the other resources that are available to you to make sure that the food that you produce is as safe as you can make it. That's it from me, Sophie. Happy to hand over back to you.
Thank you so much, David. That was great. Thank you. And we'll hand over now to Selvarani Elahi, who's Executive Director of the Food Authenticity Network. And then after that, we'll move on to questions. Over to you, Selvarani.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction, Sophie, and for the inviting me to speak today. In my talk today, I'll cover a little bit about what the Food Authenticity Network is, and I'll call it FAN from now to make it easier on my pronunciation, how its resources can really help food businesses implement food fraud prevention strategies, and then share with you some data on our partner project showing how global food fraud reports are behaving. Am I sharing my slides now?
I can't see them yet.
Okay, let me just retry. You see them now?
Yeah, that's it. That's great. Yeah.
Thank you. So I think the people that have spoken before me have already set everything in context, and many of us will remember the 2000 horse meat incident and how damaging that was for public confidence in the integrity of the global food supply chain, and the subsequent renowned Elliott Review and its recommendations. Well, in the UK, this led to the initiation of 4 great initiatives, which all started in 2015. The 2 food crime units that Ron has already spoken about, the Food Industry Intelligence Network, which is an industry intelligence sharing network, as it says in the name, and of course the Food Authenticity Network, which was set up with DEFRA funding to address specifically recommendation 4 of the Elliott Review, which is shown on the screen. I'm not going to read it, but effectively it says that people working in the food authenticity testing arena needed to be better coordinated and using fit-for-purpose standardized testing procedures. FAN is completely free to join, and the QR code will come up again at the end. And the main reason for joining is it's quick. It's got sort of free resources that I'll show you. It takes less than a minute, and the main benefit is you get a monthly summary email which summarizes things that have been happening in the food authenticity and food fraud area within the month, and then you can just click on the resources and information that's relevant to you. Our membership has grown steadily from when we launched in July 2015, and we're over now 5,400 members from 112 countries, and they come from a range of countries, as you can see here, obviously being UK in origin. The UK membership is still our largest membership category, but for our next 3-year strategy, we hope to make that more international on the basis that because you're dealing with global food supply chains, as the speakers before me have said, really the network has to be truly global. Our 3 membership, the 3 largest membership categories are the food industry, analysts that can be working in the industry, or for regulators, and now actually regulators and consultants are now equal at 11% of the membership. Although we were set up with government funding in 2019, for 2 reasons, we transitioned into a public-private funded partnership led by LGC. Firstly, because we wanted to create a sustainable funding framework for the future, but also because in recognition of the fight against food fraud should be a collaborative effort between government and industry. And these are our current partners shown on this slide here. The FAN resources, there's plenty of free resources for you. As I said, everything on the information is open access. And when we launched in July 2015, our aim primarily was around food authenticity testing. However, although analysts like me get very excited by that, I think food businesses, they want to try and prevent the food fraud from happening in the first place. So in December of that year, we added our food fraud prevention pages. And you can see that there's many resources there, but the tools, guides and information reports there at the moment, we've got 20 listed for tools, 23 guides and 18 reports. And I wanted to just highlight a few of these. So Ron's already told you about the Food Standards Scotland Food Crime Risk Profiling Tool, and the NFCU last year also published some food crime guidance for businesses. And I know Ron works very closely, as he said, with the FSA's NFCU. And David's already mentioned the Food Authenticity Guide produced by FDF. And this was originally produced in 2014, but in recognition of the fact that the global supply chains have changed, become more complex, the guide was reviewed and FAN inputted into that review and was updated and published last year. And if you're looking for a simple introduction into starting about risk assessments and vulnerability assessments, that guide is very good. And also John Spink, who is a real thought leader in this area and works at Michigan State University, has produced some blogs on FAN that we've collated into a step-by-step guide for anyone who really is new to this area, starting all the way from definitions, all the way through to how you assess risk and vulnerability, and come straight through to your business in terms of the likelihood of that risk happening in your business. So definitely worth a look there, and it's all signposted in the link there. One of the main reasons that FAN was set up was to signpost to authoritative food authenticity testing expert labs, because when the horse meat incident happened in 2013, it was very difficult for stakeholders to know which labs to trust and where you could get reliable results from. So currently there are 21 different food authenticity centres of expertise listed on FAN, and you have, for each of those, that you have a named contact, a telephone number, an email address. So if you have any queries relating to their areas of expertise, you can contact these laboratories and get some advice. And they're organised into 5 different categories, as you can see here. Just to finish off, I wanted to share with you one of our partner projects. So this is funded in part by the funding we get from external partners. I think we've all agreed, for the reasons before mentioned, that we're currently in a high risk environment where food crime and food fraud can happen very easily. But one of the questions we keep getting asked is, well, what's next? You know, what commodities are going to be hit next? What's the next biggest fraud? Ideally, we'd like one of those. But because we haven't, what we did in FAN is that we collaborated with 3 of the world's largest food fraud incident collation tool providers. That's Food Chain ID, Horizon Scan, and Safety HUD. And they all collect food fraud data from the world, from different sources, process them in different ways with slightly different outputs. But that in itself can be quite confusing for people when you're looking at trends. So what we wanted to do is get them to work together to try and provide a more robust benchmark for assessing whether food fraud incidents are actually increasing or not. And I'm very pleased to be able to share the 2024 data with you. So looking at the data from 2 of these tools that report in very similar ways, these are the top 10 foods in 2024 that had the most official global regulatory food fraud reports against them. So that's reports from regulatory agencies across the world. We've discounted media reports and other sources of information on the basis of not that many of them in comparison to regulatory reports. So we felt this was a more reliable platform going forward. So the million, just before I get to the final slide, this was just to show you that if you take into account another tool, which is using a source of regulatory reports, media reports, and peer review publications, you get a slightly different picture of your top 10 foods in 2024. However, if you look at 2 different types of tools, you'll see that then the color coding just shows similar food commodities. There's 7 of the top commodities actually shared between the different tools, showing that year on year, these are the types of foods that are most reported as being adulterated. This doesn't necessarily mean that these are the world's most adulterated foods, because as we know, food crime units and Operation Opsum, Interpol, people like that do target different food groups. One of the key messages I wanted to just convey is that different tool providers process tools and information in a different way. So you need to pick the most appropriate horizon scanning tool for your business. So the $1 million question is there evidence of increasing fraud? And based on the data that we've collated with these tool providers, working with them from January 2023 and just finishing with the December 2024 data, so 2 years worth of data, we would say the answer is no, because the top line here is total regulatory reports. That's food safety and food fraud. This is food safety, the red line. And then the sort of brown line at the bottom is food fraud incidents. Although they go slightly up and down, if you put error bars on these, they all look very similar. So global regulatory activity remains largely the same since 2023. It doesn't mean that fraud may not be going up, but the amount of reporting that's going on has remained fairly consistent. Thank you very much. And just an acknowledgement to our Partners Advisory Board and executive team. And just to point you to a latest creative piece that we did with a lot of thought leaders across the world. Had a little bit of fun around food fraud and food authenticity, but just to highlight the importance of it, which you can enjoy at your leisure. Please do join. It's completely free and there's lots of resources on there, and you can contact me for any other information if you need to. Thank you very much. I hand over back to Sophie now.
Thank you. That was really interesting and great, highlighting all those resources for businesses. So I'll share your slides after with everyone as well, so they can easily access the links. Yeah, so if all speakers want to pop their cameras on, then we can move on to questions now. So yeah, if you do want to start posting any questions that you have, if you can post them in the chat, because you won't be able to unmute. So if you can post your questions in the chat, and then we can get started. I have one for Ron to start off with about the tool. So what does FSS do with the data collected?
Yeah, thanks, Sophie. So at FSS, we record some registration information like emails, names, businesses, etc. Two reasons for this. We require contact information to be able to send you your tailored report at the end. And the other questions around where businesses is located and the sector your business is involved in, is to see if there are any trends in the data around specific sectors that may require additional help, information on specific areas detailed in the tool. We can use that looking at running specific sector workshops, or to target an increase in uptake in the tool in that particular area. But for those of you who have used the tool, we're not asking you to input any specific information about your business and your business processes into the tool. We're basically asking you to assess your business against the areas that I mentioned earlier.
Okay, thank you. So probably one for Chris and Salvarani. What is the biggest issue that gives you cause for concern in terms of food crime currently? It's really quite interesting to hear what you guys think, each of you.
Right. I'll go first, Salvarani, and then you can come up with a much more measured answer. But to me, because I'm professor of food safety, it's those things that will impact human health, particularly the vulnerable, the very old, the very young. And I gave the kind of case study around cinnamon, and it tends to be ingredients that are adulterated, heavily adulterated, and often they can either be with toxic compounds like the lead that I talked about, or potentially with really serious food allergens. So that's what worries me, is this unintentional exposure to food allergens. It could be peanuts, it could be celery, and I think that's always the greatest risk, because a lot of these food ingredients that I talked about, particularly the herbs and spices, they end up in millions and millions of different food products, and that is the most difficult to manage and the most difficult to control. So over to you, Salvarani.
Thanks a lot, Chris. No, I absolutely agree. I mean, a lot of the times food fraud and food crime is often dismissed as just a consumer choice issue. Okay, you might be paying 5p more for this, or what, what's the big deal? But actually, if you look back in history over the last 20 years, 3 out of 4 of the largest food crime issues, global issues, have had food safety implications. And when you get fraudsters infiltrating the supply chain, they're not really going to choose premium cuts or, the choice ingredients to adulterate the foods. They're just going to put in whatever to maximize profits. So completely agree with what Chris said there. And allergens is definitely a risk. Also, I think a lot of businesses worry about the big things that they can't really control, climate change. And obviously we all need to try and improve these things, but you can't do anything immediately in your business about that straight away. Whereas actually looking at vulnerabilities that are relevant to your business, I think is very, very key. So you need to look at risks and vulnerability assessments as relevant to your business, so you can control as much of that as possible. And also in the last 10 years, we've all heard a lot about food safety culture. So if you can create that culture of excellence in your throughout your employees, from the CEO all the way through to people making the food, that has a very positive effect on the business and prevents people from actually straying or committing fraud. And we don't like to admit that there might be people within food businesses actually doing this, but there is evidence. It's not just the organised criminals. There are people within businesses somewhere, somebody is doing this. And the more that you can create this cultural excellence and getting everybody working towards common goals is really critical. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so what work is FSS doing in terms of resources for local authorities to tackle this issue, given the resources are tight? Ron, that's a good thing for you.
Thanks, Sophie. I mean, I think we're all aware of just how tight resources are, and it's probably not getting any better. I think from an FSS perspective, I'm not directly involved in all the discussions around how we can support local authority, other than from an SFCIU perspective in terms of food fraud and incident handling. So, I mean, what we need to do moving forward is try and utilise the technology so that it makes it easier for local authority officers who are on the ground. Yet, I think that there is acknowledgement that resources are tight, and we need to look at how do we increase those resources so that local authorities have got the time that they need to devote to the areas of work that are extremely important and should be prioritised. And I think FSS are at the moment discussing this with the Scottish Government. And I think from our perspective in terms of the SFCIU, we're there to try and support local authorities. We work very closely with local authority areas on quite a lot of the investigations that have been ongoing. If I give one example, there was a investigation into DNP, which is the industrial chemical that individuals have been using to help them lose weight. There was a conviction last year in relation to that from a gentleman from Falkirk area. And again, we worked very closely with the local authority on that. That needed, I suppose, support from the local authority, support from ourselves to work collectively with the police to develop that joint investigation to a point where actually we were able to have an impact on the risks that individual himself was putting put on the public and consumers. So it's a really difficult one because, you know, there's an awful lot of discussion around budgets and cuts and, you know, all the things that we've seen in terms of in the news of late. I think what we need to do is try to focus on prevention, because certainly from my perspective, and I'm trying not to speak from my local authority colleagues here, but I'm pretty sure that local authority colleagues would prefer to be speaking to their businesses about prevention and not speaking to the businesses about becoming a victim of crime or having to deal with an incident that's putting consumers at risk because they've been a victim of food crime. And I think that's why we've got to try and work together collectively to do what we can to prevent this type of food crime, this type of incident that we've heard from all our presenters this morning, particularly Chris speaking about the examples. So, yeah.
Thank you. And we've had someone ask, I would very much like to hear about the popcorn fraud from Professor Elliott, please. I'm not sure if that's...
Popcorn fraud. I can't admit that I know about a particular popcorn fraud, but maybe this is a challenge to me about incidents of fraud in any commodity. So for popcorn, it would be, think about, well, the constituents corn, and there was actually a huge scandal going back about the same time as the horse meat scandal about corn that was being sold actually as being safe for consumption, and it wasn't. It was horribly contaminated with a mycotoxin called aflatoxin, and that caused massive food safety risks. And then you've got, what are the other constituents? It could be the salt, if you like, salty popcorn, that there's fraud in salt. It could be the sugar itself. Is the claim that it's organic sugar? Is the claim that it's come from sugarcane or sugar beet? So there would be a lot of issues around the labelling as well. And of course, the other potential risk is even the food packaging material itself. Has that met all of the particular standards that are required? Or, as I'm picking up more and more now, fraud, believe it or not, in food packaging materials, people claiming that it has been recycled or claiming that it's been made from bamboo and other things. So I think it's a good example is you think popcorn's popcorn, but there's different ingredients and even the wrapping itself is vulnerable. So I hope I passed the challenge.
I'm sure you have. Okay, so another question, this might be for you, David. Scotland has a very valuable food brand, Scotch beef. What steps are you taking to ensure the amount of Scotch beef that is being sold doesn't exceed the amount of Scotch cattle that are entering the market? I'm not sure who that's for, possibly yourself or Ron. Oh.
Probably
No.
not for me, because we don't represent Scotch beef. That's the
Yeah.
Quality Meat Scotland
Okay.
brand. But yeah, it's it's one of those questions, I think, where you can see, as Tony has asked in the chat, where there's a brand and where there's a brand value, then the danger of people taking advantage of that brand value and passing something off is incredibly high. So that's one example where it could happen. As to particular steps being taken, that's for others, I'm afraid, not for me.
And just to step in, like all brands, it's about the industry itself absolutely monitoring the amount that is produced and the amount that's sold, and that's called mass balancing. Okay, what is produced and what's sold should balance each other. And there's a famous example with honey, Manuka honey, that could potentially come from New Zealand, the authentic. And when you look at the mass balance, there is globally 10 times more Manuka honey that's sold than is produced. If you get a mass balance like that, you pretty much know there's fraud going on.
Okay, thank you. How can FDFS help FSS in terms of food crime prevention, David?
Well, we can do a lot. Obviously, I talk to Food Standards Scotland all the time about things that are going on in the industry. So if there are things that people want me to raise and talk to FSS about, we do that for our members. And we are, of course, always happy to support the development of new material and new ways of helping business. So I hope Ron will agree. I've been a strong advocate of the food crime reporting tool since before it existed, and as I've said, we are already produce guidance and other things on food authenticity, not just for our members actually, but they're available to anyone in the food and drink industry. So there are lots of things that we do, from sharing understanding and intelligence to supporting businesses to understand both their obligations and how to approach those obligations. So lots and lots of ways we do that every day.
Thank you. Chris and Salvarani, do you feel there is a more common food that is or more likely to be targeted? Is there something that you feel is most likely to be targeted? Or really, it could be anything.
Well, again, whenever you start to do risk assessments, it's about the food commodities or ingredients that come through the most complex supply chains, because there's a lot more opportunities for fraud. And the more mixing, the more processing that goes on, there are more and more opportunities there as well. And often the big difficulty is if it's one of those ingredients that I've talked about, It can end up in a complex food. It can end up in a ready meal. And then it's really, really difficult actually to manage the risk. And the risk has to be managed much, much further back in the supply chain. So it's just understanding complexities of your supply chain. Do you know who you're buying it from? And do you know those potential risks that you're bringing into your business?
You know, I'd agree with that, Chris. Yeah, the more complicated the food, obviously, it's more difficult to trace all the ingredients back. I've just posted into the chat the 2 pie charts, and Sophie will be sharing my presentation. I'll also put a link into the 2024 Global Food Fraud Report on FAN. So I would encourage people to read that. It's not as simple as saying what's the most adulterated foods in the world, unfortunately. It is quite nuanced. The tools do different things. That's the whole reason that we try to produce this report on an annual basis, to give some sort of benchmark that we can keep on tracking. But absolutely knowing your supply chains, I think that's vital. We did a piece of work for DEFRA probably now 5 years ago, just before Brexit was coming up. So they wanted to look at global drivers of risk and what risk was important to the UK. And we looked at supply chains and what tools businesses were already using at that time. And what we found is, you know, digitization obviously can help. It can help reduce things and get your assessment of things in real time. But I think it came when it came to the crux of it, people agreed. Most businesses said that you can't replace sort of subject matter expertise, and the fact that people still do business with people. So having virtual relationships and buying things online is great and quick, but actually you must always have that human interaction, those in-person audits, that relationship building to build that trust in the system. So I think definitely know who you're buying from, who you're selling to, and you can't replace that. So AI can help, but it won't replace those sorts of things. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So John has asked, are there any findings from the recent mustard contamination with peanuts that can be shared? Sure, who that would be for?
I can start with that one. Just by total coincidence, I'm actually giving a lecture on that on Thursday. It's another webinar, Trace Gains. I mean, I hope they pay me money for advertising the event. And it's another of those really complex issues. Is it contamination, accidental, or is it deliberate fraud? And I think a lot of the indications are that it wasn't fraud. It was just unbelievably poor quality assurance. It was not understanding your supply chains, and it was the contamination actually happened way back where the mustard was being grown, because there was what was called co-cropping. They were growing basically mustard and peanuts in the same area, and one cross-contaminated the other. And you know, the businesses that were affected were many. I mean, there was literally millions of different food items had to be withdrawn from the market. It cost an absolute fortune. And there was a reliance on certification from a company actually that didn't have the correct control of their supply chains. So it wasn't fraud as far as I can make out.
So, Sophie, just to add to that, yeah, I mean, I kind of agree with Chris's comments there. I think obviously FSA were the lead for this incident, and we worked closely with them during the incident, and we'll be working closely with them to identify the lessons learned. And I would hope that at some point these lessons learned will be shared with industry through the appropriate channels.
And one other sort of technical issue from a measurement perspective, as Chris says, sometimes these are not frauds, and it could be that our the contaminating species is actually very close genetically in nature. So some of the information we have in our databases are not, they don't go down specific enough so that you can make these differentiations. So you might be able to get to a family, but not down to the individual species. And there is some, I'm not able to say because the work's still in progress, but I think the Food Standards Agency are doing some work into looking at how reliable some of those some of that information in those publicly owned databases is.
Thank you all. So Andrew's asked, what practical advice can you provide regarding understanding of supply chains? Using documents or questionnaires to ask the information from suppliers doesn't seem sufficiently watertight. What other tools can you recommend?
There are some resources. I can start off, Sophie.
Yeah.
There are some resources on Plan. There's not that much on supply chain assurance for sure, but GFSI certification schemes, if you are certified to any of these schemes, there is that agents and brokers guide, and there's lots of information there as well about the templates and forms and what sort of questions you need to have in place for that sort of business to business relationship.
Great.
And I can give the answer of cheating a little bit, okay? And one of the pieces of advice I give is, who else does that supplier supply? You know, do they supply Marks and Spencers? Do they supply Sainsbury's? Because those are companies with really massive technical teams who do a huge amount of checking and inspection. It's not a guarantee, but my goodness, the likelihood that those companies perpetrate fraud is pretty low.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's a good point. I think probably time for one more question. The question from Jim: how many prosecutions have there been in Scotland for food fraud in the last 2 years? Not sure if anybody knows that. Or we're allowed run.
Well, yeah, that's probably a question for me. It's quite a difficult one because I think ultimately when the unit probably kicked off in all seriousness, probably about 2018, and you've then got the whole issues around COVID and the backlog through the courts, etc. I mentioned earlier we had a conviction for DNP, and that individual was sentenced to 4 years imprisonment. And I know that the proceeds of crime hearing was just heard. I think there's been 3 offences under Food Hygiene Scotland regs that in terms of FSS approved premises, where there was a £4,000 charge. But what we're going to start to see now is probably quite a steady now stream of cases going to court. We've got believe it or not, a Scottish tea fraud, which will be going to court this year. Who knew there'd be such a thing as Scottish tea? But clearly there wasn't, and that's why it's going to court. We'll start to see these things now start to come through their way through the criminal justice process. I think since we've kicked off, in all seriousness, we've had something around the region of 47 investigations. 11 of those have been identified as fraud, 4 identified as culpable and reckless conduct, and there's been other types of offences. What we have found has been quite effective is using common law. So common law fraud, if there's no risk to health, and culpable or reckless conduct, if there is a risk to health. That's been quite effective, and most of the cases that are going through the courts at the moment will be one of the, certainly from an FSS perspective, will be one of those to either be food fraud or culpable or reckless conduct. So it has been a bit slow, but I believe that we'll start to see hopefully start to see some more convictions over the next few months with these cases being called to court.
That's great. Thank you. And I think that's 2 o'clock pretty much. So I think we'll end it there. But if we have missed any questions, I'll go through them after, and we can always send emails to answer your questions. But thank you so much to David, Salvarani, Chris and Ron for being here today, and for talking to you all. And we will be sending the recording round and any of the presentations and links to the tools as well. So thank you so much all, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.